Good morning. It's October 22nd in New York City, and I wanted to share my reflections on the Ibn Arabi conference at Columbia University. So here's an image of the program. I came to this conference through my engagement with the Ibn Arabi Society, and so this was an assemblage of academics, speakers, and interested scholars and practitioners for a one-day conference preceded by a Qawwali concert the night before, which was excellent. I wanted to offer my reflections on the conference for whomever might be interested. And so I have 5 main takeaways to share. The first takeaway I wanted to reflect on was on the theme of the power of vulnerability, the power of vulnerability. What I found particularly powerful was when presenters, and considered that these presenters are scholars and academics, I found it powerful when the presenters were able to speak from an embodied sense of heart and emotion, when they were able to bring in their own personal story and engagement with the themes and subjects of their talk, what they were passionate about. This really struck me. There was, for example, one speaker, Professor Amer Latif from Emerson College or University, and he spoke about his own personal journey to coming to Ibn Arabi's work. He spoke about his beginnings studying science, engineering, and then after discovering quantum physics, also in relation to his own personal sense of finding meaning, that study of quantum physics led to his initial engagement with Ibn Arabi, and now he is a professor engaged with this material. And it was very powerful to hear his personal story. He's someone who consciously used language that referred to the embodied. And from my experience in the education sector, teaching mindfulness in education and contemplative practice, I really value the power of educators to use what we would call skillful self-disclosure. That's a term that I learned from Sam Himmelstein, a mindfulness educator in the Bay Area. But how can we as educators and academics share of ourselves, bring our own vulnerability, and not just stay in a place of scholarly authority in what we're sharing? And so to varying degrees, I felt all of the presenters were able to do this. And it was implicit in their being here at the conference, but some really emphasized that more in their presentations. There was a moment when Professor Oladimini Ogunike from University of Virginia began part of his presentation, which was on a West African Sufi teacher. And he shared at the beginning of his presentation some of the myths about Sufism in West Africa, some of the biases and myths that people have, misconceptions that they have about Sufism in West Africa. And he stated that he hoped one day not to have to name these myths or unpack these myths at the beginning of a presentation. And there was a third example of that, with William Chittick engaging not in his speaking position as the keynote speaker, but responding to a question when he was sitting to the side. And I really appreciated how his impromptu engagement on the spur of the moment just led to a sort of casual, loose but very impassioned response to the question at hand. And so I'm interested in how do we as educators or academics, how do we step out of our roles of that place of authority, or whatever the expectations of what that looks like are, and how do we break open our humanity in speaking of the subject matters we're so passionate about. Second theme I wanted to speak to was the quality of the audience. I was so impressed by the audience attending this conference. I'm assuming that it was a combination of scholars, whether students currently in school or academics currently teaching in education sectors, and then also practitioners, people who are passionate about Ibn Arabi and wanted to engage in person. So, but I think all of us at heart had some deep personal connection to being there. And it's just an incredibly well-informed, well-educated audience. The intelligence of the questions was really impressive to me. I also wanted to note just how respectful the audience was. I often find myself at conferences or in settings where, when it's question time, sometimes the questioners in the audience end up with a 5-minute preamble before they get to their question. And it can feel as if they are trying to get a need met around speaking about themselves or their own interests, rather than really putting the focus on this collective moment and honoring everyone's time and other people's time for questions. So the questions were very to the point and respectful in terms of the use of time that the audience members took in asking their questions. So I was really impressed by the audience. Just the general engagement was wonderful. And there's definitely a very warm and welcoming sense. I didn't necessarily talk to more than a few people there, but I definitely felt very comfortable in the space and welcomed in the space. The third theme I wanted to speak to touches on the area that's topical, particularly in many academic and institutional settings, is around diversity. And so what I really wanted to speak to was this theme of the necessity of diversity. Now, I know people will have quibbles about the use of the word diversity in terms of whether that is always the best word choice for exploring this topic, but I'll keep it simple in that way. So one of the things I noted, and I have a limited perspective on academic presentations of Ibn Arabi over the last few decades, and I don't have a full picture on what the Ibn Arabi Society is doing, which we're helping to present this event. But I will broadly generalize and say that I am noticing a shift from the scholars and speakers in as reflected in this current conference to be representing a shift in recent years from a more Anglo-American or Euro-American centered culture to a more globally representative culture. And that feels really valuable to me. I think one of the beauties of Ibn Arabi's work is how he is pointing to each person's direct and differentiated connection to the divine. And so I think, along with the theme of the unity of being, the emphasis on the power of the differentiation in the multiplicity of beings is just as important in emphasis. And so when we can bring this shared conversation and that feeling of our shared being into this manifest representation of our differentiation and our differentiated expression. I think it's really powerful for everyone. And so I loved the differentiation or diversity in the speakers, whether along gender lines or cultural background. So that felt very important. There were also academics, professors whose work I hadn't been aware of before, so I appreciated the way that they were given an opportunity to speak. Loved that new points of view on Ibn Arabi's work, new areas of study can come into the shared conversation. Also wanted to just name a theme that sometimes came through in the conference, was just really reflecting on how the cultural places we come from in this conversation are related to colonization and decolonization in different ways. So, for example, for me as someone who grew up as a white person in the UK and then came to the States, there's so much implicit in my personal or cultural outlook that reflects a more colonized point of view, to the point which I'm often not aware of that. So I'm often operating on these very conditioned contexts or understandings. And in a sense, I both have what one might call a privilege or a luxury in that, but also you could say a pain of forgetting that I come from that place of assumed mindset of a colonial or even capitalistic or individualistic cultural place. So the way that decolonization was gently named at various points in the conference, for example, there was a speaker from Pakistan who I believe named that in his presentation, to how that came into his personal story too. So colonization, decolonization, I feel like are always going to be very continuing important themes in cross-cultural gatherings, and rightfully so. So I appreciated the way that was gently touched on. I think the last thing on this theme of diversity is, I remember reading a report from the consulting firm McKinsey on DEI or diversity in the workplace, and they made the point that for maybe Boomer or Gen X generations, diversity is seen more as, let's say, an ethical or a moral imperative in the workplace, whereas the millennial generation sees this more as being about innovation. So I really wanted to name that dimension of diversity. Is, I think there can so often be a political or political tug of war around diversity as to, should I say, a reactivity to diversity or equity. And I really want to emphasize that, from my point of view, just the importance of innovation, which we so desperately need in a world which is facing so many different crises. We need innovation. We need different points of view, and so I value that ongoing work and effort by the organizers to make that happen. Fourth theme I wanted to name was around some of the themes that personally stood out to me. Now, this is certainly a very subjective point of view, and reflects some of my more contemplative interests that connect to the broader work I'm doing. Some of the content themes that stood out to me and that appeared in several of the presentations were, one, around what's referred to as the covenant between the divine and humanity, in Islam, and that is this encounter before time or outside of time, in which the divine or the Lord of each being says to it, be. So it's this bringing into existence from non-existence, this divine command of be. And so this came up through several of the presentations. And one particular takeaway I had around that was this reminder that this divine command or bringing into being of each of us as beings is not a one-time event. This is a continual creation or recreation. So if we think of this from the point of view of quantum physics, that each of us as aggregated beings are coming into existence from nothingness or emptiness in every moment. We're dissimulating and reaggregating in micro time. So when I take this reflection on this divine command, or you could say this generous gift of bringing us into creation over and over again, sustaining us in being recreated over and over again, to the degree of efficiency that we don't even notice it. It's, think of like, if that was a technology, it would be like the most powerful technology ever, if it could bring beings into and out of existence without them even noticing. The kind of like peace or harmony or fluidity or and majesty and beauty in that is something that is profound. And so to consider that we might not even be aware that that's happening and that it is happening is just a very powerful meditation and contemplation to continue to reflect on. A second theme that ran throughout some of the presentations was this hadith, a divine, which is an attributed divine saying, either to God or to Muhammad. And this hadith was attributed to God. It can be translated in different ways, but one way is, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. Or as one of the professors mentioned, I forget how he mentioned, but it might be something to the effect of, I was an unknown treasure and I love to be recognized. But essentially, what's being pointed to here is this God or the divine or the real in its essence has this breath of compassion that comes with a statement, and life is created, existence is created through the divine's desire for self-recognition, for self-reflection. And so it's this movement of, as was described in one talk, of intention and desire and imagination. And so, yeah, I've always found when I've shared this phrase with folks in different settings, how much it resonates. And I always feel like when we contemplate on this phrase, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known, that for the sense that each of us is an expression of this divinity, that this is also true for all of us, that this hidden treasure is inside of us. And also us as beings, as differentiated beings, love to be known and love to be in relationship, whether it is to what we could call the divine, or whether it is with other human beings or non-human beings. The third theme that stood out to me from this reflection on some of the themes of the conference was certainly reflects a personal interest of mine. This was on the subject of the Ain Thabita. So this is kind of a complex and more subtle philosophical term in the conversation around Ibn Arabi. So I'll try and just speak to it from my point of view before getting too technical, or without getting too technical. So the Ain Thabita is sometimes translated as the immutable entities, or the fixed entities. And forgive me if this isn't the most accurate description, but what I would describe it as is that each thing or being has their own, let's say, portion of essence in that larger divinity. Let's see if I can fix this lighting. Okay, so the Ain Thabita is it's as if each of us, each person or thing, is an existentiated form. So we are an appearance in form, and each unique appearance in form has its own unique non-existent counterpart. And when we hear this term non-existent, we might think it just means there's no such thing, it doesn't exist. But we want to think of non-existent more in the space of something that has its essence outside of space or time, so it isn't existing in the way we think of manifest form. So in a very simple way, we could think of this as a complementarity. Each being or each thing has its existent aspect and its non-existent aspect. And one might even say that the non-existent aspect, the Ain Thabita, contains all of the possible forms of the existent aspect of us. So let's say you take the Barnaby that was speaking at the beginning of this video and the Barnaby that's speaking in this moment. Each of those is a different differentiated space-time version of Barnaby in manifest form. And in the Ain Thabita, and all of the possible excuse the lighting, I'll just proceed. All of the possible forms of Barnaby, of existentiated Barnaby, are somehow pregnant, so to speak, or real in the Ain Thabita. So that's just perhaps one point of view, and it may or may not be accurate, but it might give you a flavor of what this Ain Thabita is. So I was very struck by that impassioned impromptu moment by William Chittick that I mentioned in the conference, where he really was emphasizing the Ain Thabita as something that each person needs to orient to, and in a sense it is related to what Ibn Arabi might call what Ibn Arabi might call the private face or the special face of the divine. So each of us has this very personal orientation to the divine or to what is called Lord. And by orienting in that way, my sense is that we are in a, let's say, a non-local relational engagement with this essence of ourselves. And I feel like there is, even though we are not knowing the divine, we are knowing a, let's say, a quality or a name or an intermediary of the divine, that in knowing it in our own way, through representation through the imaginal, mediation through the imaginal, we are receiving signs or guidance or orientation, like a GPS to the unfolding in existentiated form of who we are as manifest beings. So please excuse the sun for moving in and out. But since I don't have any technical expertise, I'll just continue on. Down to the last section here. So the last theme I wanted to touch on, I titled, "What is Emergent?" See if I can close the curtain here a little bit. And what is emergent? For me, what's emergent engaging with this conference, coming out of this conference? First of all is the value of cross-cultural conversation. So I touched on differentiation or diversity. And I really loved that within some of the content themes of the presentations, there was discussion about cross-cultural conversation. For example, what was the cross-cultural conversation between Hinduism and Islam several hundred years ago, when translations of Hindu texts were made into Arabic and or Persian. So I feel like there's something very juicy and alive about the way that whatever we are trying to tackle as humans, the power of this cross-cultural conversation, these different perspectives and points of views are really going to energize the space of those conversations and provide us a lot of different insights by bringing differentiated perspectives together. That's something that stood out to me. So second thing, a question that's emergent for me is, what's the role of non-Muslims in this conversation? So I'm someone who's had a long contemplative practice, probably almost 30 years at this point, studying most prominently in Buddhist or non-dual traditions, studying the work of Ibn Arabi and to some degree Islam in the last, Islam more generally in the last, let's say 4 years. And for me, as someone who does not identify, hasn't identified as Buddhist, who does not identify as Muslim, have more of an interspiritual identity, I suppose you could say. What is our place as non-Muslims when at times in settings like at this conference, there's a reminder that Ibn Arabi, of course, as a devout Muslim, whose work was so focused, in a sense, as an interpretation or translation, in terms of meaning of the Quran and of the Prophet Muhammad's work, So there is an understandable and important emphasis and a reminder that for Ibn Arabi, the pointer is to always come back to looking to the Prophet Muhammad for inspiration and as a model for living one's life and as practicing in one's life. So I think there's a healthy tension here, because I think this has to be, the conversation about Ibn Arabi has to be much larger than just in an Islamic context. And of course, academia is a wonderful setting for cross-cultural conversations. And I think what Ibn Arabi has to offer extends far beyond the cultural context of Islam. And, there's a tension, both for my own, let's say, spiritual development. How am I in relationship to Islam as I come to appreciate it more, but don't identify as a Muslim? And also for someone who is into spiritual and values the depth of each tradition and has a hard time, let's say, with any expression of any tradition being better or more supreme than any other. Sometimes it can feel for me within Islamic culture that there is an understanding that Islam is the best way to understand life and experience and being. So I don't seek to resolve these tensions, but simply to name them. And I think these are things we have to continue to wrestle with, both personally and collectively. That was the second thing I wanted to name as what's emergent for me. The third thing is, just how valuable it is for contemplatives to be in partnership with academia. It might be nice in this cultural context of the West, where contemplatives can have a platform that doesn't require academia, especially when they're trying to represent traditions that are outside of the dominant culture of Judeo-Christianity. Yeah, I think it was very valuable for the Ibn Arabi Society to be in this continual partnership with academia. I once remember reading that a Tibetan contemplative described academia in the West as being the church of the West. And so if we think of academia as a kind of cultural religion here, in terms of the validity we give to its viewpoints and its authority, in a sense, as contemplatives, we have to engage in academia in some form or the other, even though we also want to be careful of being subsumed by its limitations, which are also reflective of the limitations of the dominant culture too. And one of the speakers named one aspect of the downsides of academia is that it can be very competitive and also lack compassion. So I think what I spoke to earlier about how can we encourage academics to bring their whole being to their teaching and their work? How can they bring their heart and vulnerability? I feel like that's a very important part of how us as contemplatives can support the academy in being more healthy and more balanced. And I can tell you from my encounters with academics in college and university settings, there's a lot of unhappiness about the state of academia and how it feels to be a human being in those settings. The fourth thing I wanted to mention on what's emergent is I really appreciated that the organizers made this conference free, both to be in person and to engage with the conference online, just to make this accessible without any barriers to entry. I feel like it's just such a great gift, and I'm so appreciative that that was an intention and a practice of the organizers. For myself, who has gone on contemplative retreats, which are often quite expensive, there's obviously a huge barrier to access. And so, I just want to say that I value that. So thank you. And the fifth thing I wanted to name was something that emerged in a private conversation with another attendee. And this was someone who is looking to engage with Ibn Arabi's work academically with a mindset of being a scholar activist. And for example, they particularly were interested in how their engagement with Ibn Arabi can support healing between Muslim and Jewish communities, and how it can support healing between Muslim and Hindu communities. So I think along with this bringing the personal and the vulnerable into academia, I think this calling for us to be scholar activists or contemplative activists, each in our own way, in whatever way we're called, is also very important. Again, in this time where there are so many crises in the world, how can our contemplative and academic engagement allow our own hearts to express themselves, so that we're all functioning as healers? There's a beautiful passage by a Hawaiian mystic and elder, Hale Makua, and in one of his comments, he said that sooner or later, whether it's in this lifetime or the next, all of us are destined to become healers, and to help heal others. But before we can help heal others, we have to heal ourselves. So if we think of this being healers as our destiny, how do we function as contemplatives or as academics or as activists, knowing that our ultimate destiny is to function as healers? And the last point I wanted to make, one of the nice things about being in person at these events is to really make those in-person connections that can't be reproduced online. And so I had the good fortune to get to connect with someone who was sitting near me, and we were in conversation about his experiences of this conference, having attended for many, many years and seen the community grow and evolve. And even though in one sense it's small, there might have been somewhere between 100 and 125 people in person, maybe another 50 to 75 online, at least for the live part of it. It's still a small community and a small community of academics, but he noted to me, having seen it over the years, that it really is growing. And so the beauty of its smallness is that for anybody who's interested to engage in it, now is a great time to learn more about Ibn Arabi, to have access. Maybe if you're a scholar and want to study or teach Ibn Arabi, still a great time to get into the field, because he's still so largely unknown in particularly Western academic contexts, that you could imagine that every major university should or will have, and even any smaller university should or will have someone who's versed in Ibn Arabi down the line, because of the importance of his work and the importance of his work to this, to the global crises we face. So it's both small, but also growing. So there's something in that growingness that feels very vital and alive. And there's a lot of excitement and energy at the conference, and as reflected in the quality of the audience and the quality of the questions and engagement. So this is a growing community. I hope this kind of ad hoc, I decided to take on the hat of contemplative journalist of sorts to report on this conference, and to do this in a hotel room where I'm not getting the light right, or even doing too much preparedness. But I thought one of my contributions to the larger community could be just to share my reflections. So those of you who weren't there or who were there might find some value in my reflections, in contributing to a larger conversation. So thank you to everybody who was there. Thank you to everybody I met. Thank you to the organizers and the sponsors and Columbia University. And I look forward to continuing to be part of this conversation. Many blessings to all of you.